everyone, welcome to another Arduino lesson. I hope everybody's doing great. So we've talked a little bit about blinking LEDs, stuff like that, a lot about theory, how the board works, coding, and all that stuff is definitely need to know. But today we're going to talk about buttons and using buttons with the Arduino. And this is something that you're going to find yourself doing a lot of. So this is basic yet important. And as always, to avoid information overload and complicating things, we're going to start off simple and then progress from there. So I have here a little push button switch, the kind that you might use with Arduino, and I have a schematic representation of this switch. And one of the first things to notice about this is that we have 4 pins, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2 of them are connected internally, and another 2 are connected internally. And if we flip this guy over, indeed we can see there are 4 little pins. And when you're using this button, you got to be really careful that you hook it up right, because again, there are 2 and 2 pins that are connected internally. So theoretically, you could use this button to control 2 devices at once, but you may or may not want to do that. The question here that we're going to try to answer, or we are going to answer actually, is, okay, how do I know out of these 4 pins, looking at this thing, which ones are connected inside and which ones are not? And the answer to that is pretty simple. And what I'm going to do in order to stabilize this so it doesn't move around is I'm going to break out this little breadboard here, and I'm going to stick this button first in the breadboard across this gap, because all these points are connected, and this kind of breaks it so these are not connected all the way across the board. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to grab my trusty ohm meter, and I'm going to put it on continuity. Now, you don't have to do this, because if you put it in the breadboard wrong, you're going to get a wrong reading. For example, if I were to stick the button here, since these points are all connected, and I put it in the wrong way, I would get a false reading. But I'm just doing this because I don't want the button to move around when I'm trying to take the reading. So I'm going to go ahead and do my reading here, and I'm going to take these 2 pins. And you hear that noise, that means these 2 pins are connected internally, and on the other side, same situation. And then over here we have these 2 pins that are not, unless of course I press the button, which I'm doing now, then I'm letting it go. So that is how we figure out which ones are connected and which ones are not, and how to properly wire a switch. So let's get rid of that. I'm going to bring in this circuit here. And here we see the Arduino Uno. We have a push button switch, an LED, and a couple of resistors. There's a 1K here to limit the current to the LED, and then here's a 10K resistor that serves a different purpose. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate the circuit. So first we know what it does, and I think you already probably have a pretty good idea of what it's supposed to do. And when I push the button, the LED comes on. When I let it go, it goes off. And I want to kill this light for a minute so you can see a little bit better. Okay. So I'm pushing the button, LED comes on. When I let the button go, it goes off. And there's a slight delay there, but for all intent, that's the way it works, and that's fine. So I want to look at the schematic, take a closer look at the schematic, and talk about how this is wired. And then we're going to get into the code and discuss the code for this, and maybe make some modifications too to make this circuit a little bit better. Well, I don't want to use the word better because it really depends on what you're doing with it. So we're going to go ahead and make some modifications to the code once we get into the code to change its behavior slightly. But first, we're going to jump over and take a look at the schematic and discuss really quick how it's wired. Okay, everybody, here is the schematic. Before we get into the code, I just want to quickly go over it. So here we can see we have our push button switch, and like I said, there are 2 points that are tied together here internally and here. So we're not using these other 2 pins. We're just using the one going to 5 volts, and then the other one is going to this 10K resistor here, which we're going to talk about in a second. And I do want to note before we go any further that these 2 points here, they are not connected. Okay, just to make that clear, there is no connection here. So we have just an LED with a current limiting resistor. The cathode goes to ground, and then the resistor limits the current so we don't burn out the LED or actually burn out the Arduino, because these pins can only source so much current. And then here on pin 12, we have this 10K resistor. And when the switch is open, this pin 12 sees 0 volts. But when you push the switch and it closes, what happens is it sees the 5 volts applied. The 5 volts drops across this resistor, and the pin 12 sees 5 volts. So if you were just to imagine taking your voltmeter and then putting the positive lead here and then the negative lead at ground, if you were to do that and then close a switch, you would see 5 volts. So this resistor is here, so the pin sees the 5 volts when the button is pressed. So this pin 12, kind of controls pin 11, and you'll see in the code exactly how that works. But really, that's all there is to the schematic here. Not much else to it. So let's go and take a look at some code. So here we are in the Arduino IDE, and I've already have the code up that controls the circuit that we talked about and turns the LED on when the button is pressed and off when it's released. So let's go through this line by line so we know what all this stuff means. Up here, we just have a couple of integers we declare, and these are just pin numbers. So the button was connected to pin 12, we may remember, and the LED to pin 11. So that's all this is just the pin numbers here. Then we have button state, which is another variable, and we're going to go ahead and set that equal to 0. It's going to give us the push button status. So that's all before setup, and here we come into setup, and you see the pin mode function we talked about in an earlier tutorial. And really all we're going to do here is take the button pin, make it an input, and the lead pin, make it an output. And that's all there is to setup. Now, we fall into the loop,